Hello and welcome back to the Data Privacy Lawyer. It's Funmi, principal attorney at the firm. So I wanted us to take a look at cookie policies on the channel. I've already loaded this one up because usually I type it in, but I decided that I want us to see what Sephora is doing in terms of its cookie posture and what organizations can learn about different industries and how they treat cookies on their website. So let's click this. So this is the cookie and personal data. They've not specified if this is a notice. I presume that it is. It's interesting because this says this privacy policy, but above it says cookies and personal data. So I think right off the bat, it's really important to be clear with consumers what you're trying to address. Let me just scroll down. I presume this is actually not the privacy policy because it's very short. The other thing is it talks. Okay, I'm not entirely sure. Let's look at the cookie banner first, and then we can get into the substance of the cookies and personal data webpage. That's what I'm going to call it because they haven't defined what type of document this is. We use cookies to offer you the best possible website experience. Your cookie preference will be stored in your browser's local storage. This includes cookies necessary for the website's operation. Now, I am intrigued about the fact that they've only listed those that are necessary for the website's operation. Okay, but they've also listed them here. Additionally, you can freely decide and change any time whether you accept cookies or choose to opt out of cookies to improve website performance, as well as cookies used to display content tailored to your interests. Your experience of the site and the services we are able to offer may be impacted if you don't accept all cookies. Okay, the first thing I want to say is I think it would be useful to have a definition of what cookies is because this is the first thing that consumers see. Most consumers don't know what cookies are. I'm interested in the distinction between this includes cookies necessary for the website's operation, even though there are additional cookies like those related to improving the website's performance and those tailored to the interests. I think phrasing is very important. I think tone is very important. I think addressing the audience is very important. I think there's certain ways that companies can convey their message to consumers in a way that consumers will be able to understand. You know, I do this for a living, so I see a lot of these banners. I think companies need to portray their level of privacy sophistication in a time where consumers are more sophisticated on what data protection is because they see all of these enforcement actions in the news. So they're aware of what companies should be doing for them, and large organizations, even smaller ones that process personal data, need to be aware of what the standard is. Again, as long as you're complying with the data protection laws, there's no real way that you need to convey that message. Like if the law says do this, provide notice, and you're providing notice, you're compliant, right? But the regulators are very intrigued about how consumers are being able to understand what it is you're conveying to them. So that's also something that companies need to take into consideration. We're actually going to modify our preferences. So we've been presented with this preference center. This is a cookie consent manager. Now, I did this in other cookie notice audits. And when your organization is looking for a manager, this is generally something that's outsourced to a third party. You need to be very interested in the language that your cookie consent manager provider offers on the site because it needs to align with what your cookie notice says. One, it needs to align with your obligations under the data protection law, and you need to be careful about geography because that influences what the manager preference center should look like depending on where a consumer is accessing the site. So the required cookies are on. I haven't been opted into functional cookies or advertising cookies, which they did mention below. So I just want to call to your attention what I'm talking about. When we look at the cookie banner, it says, you can freely decide and change any time whether you accept cookies or choose to opt out of cookies to improve the website's performance. Now, I presume that this phrasing aligns with what they consider to be functional, which is why it's really important when you are selecting who your manager is going to be, that you're looking at this section and then what's on your site. All three of these documents go hand in hand, and they're all things that regulators are going to be looking at. And in which order do they appear, right? In addition to that, we also use the cookies to display content tailored to your interest that's related to this. These cookies serve ads relevant to your interests, so they align, right? And when you have a privacy counsel that assists you with this, they can help you have a look to make sure that all of the language is aligning because your privacy program should constantly be improving. It's not something that you do and complete because if how you operate your site changes, let's say, for example, they decide to have analytic cookies too, that will influence what the manager looks like, that will influence what the banner looks like, and that will influence what you put on your cookie notice. So That's really good. They even add the provider. This is excellent. And this goes a further layer of providing that notice to your consumers. And you can see whether it's enabled or not. I love that. I also love that I haven't been opted in, even though I'm accessing the site from the United States, which is a really Euro-centric feel. And we can see here, jobsephora.com Europe. So we're going to accept the cookies as they are and confirm my choices. We're not going to opt in. Let's take a look at this cookies and personal data. Sephora respects your concern about confidentiality of the personal information you submit. This is why Sephora informs you on its treatment. This privacy policy, what's interesting is that there's no reference to the privacy policy in the title, so maybe that's something that needs to be updated. The other interesting thing about this cookie and personal data webpage is there's no date this was last updated. I presume this is probably quite dated, given the reference to a privacy policy, the title of this webpage, and the fact that it has no date. Sephora can share this information with its subsidiaries in charge of job offers or internship offers matching your profile, as well as with any affiliate of the LVMH group which may be interested in your application. When you register on the website, now I'll tell you what I think is interesting. I just took a quick scan of what they're talking about data collection. And even though at the top of this site says cookies and personal data, which they have included personal data here, there's no real mention of cookies here. And that's quite problematic because if you're telling the public, which is me, that this is about cookies and personal data, but you don't even talk about cookies at all, what type of notice are you sending to those that are reading this? This privacy, and then also the reference to the privacy policy, even though I'm pretty sure Sephora has a separate privacy policy where they talk in detail about all of their practices. Look, we've got one here. So I don't know if this is an outdated website. It looks like this was last updated 2023. I can't be sure of that because there's no date here. But it's really important when you draft these that you're updating your website regularly to reflect what's happening at this current time. That's what consumers want to know. And make sure that your business is outlining what the web page is actually about, because this could be misleading. And in the United States, I can access this from the United States. Whether or not it's applicable to me, I don't know. But basically, your web page needs to be clear, not misleading and not deceptive. If you're going to call your web page cookies and personal data, this should also be applicable in the body of the web page too. All personal information that an internet user transmits to Sephora in exchange for the site's services is subject to French legislation. This is a very interesting sentence. I'll tell you why. What do they consider to be subject to French legislation? They've listed the French legislation, but an organization has obligations based on the data protection law. It's not exclusive to one geography. In addition to that, the GDPR regulates how personal data is processed in the European Union, of which Sephora would be required to adhere to, depending on the personal data. If the internet user is in the European Union, then the usage by Sephora is subject to the GDPR. So I don't know if it's in addition to this French legislation that's referenced to be 6th of January 1978, but this is also something that should be reviewed. If you're an organization, you need to make sure that whatever disclaimer or disclosure you're putting on the website is accurate now, and you need to be updating it as and when different laws come into place with respect to how you treat personal data. And one of the reasons I started this channel is because I wanted organizations and businesses to understand what's at stake with what you put on your website. It's your responsibility to update it, right? We've already looked at the cookie consent manager. Whoever is providing this preference center to them has already done their part in that they've talked about the required cookies, functional cookies, and advertising cookies. But when we look at this web page, there's no talk about that. And this would be problematic for a regulator. When you think about your obligations under the data protection laws, you're really looking at, one, what does my business need to do to comply? But also, what would a regulator think if they ever requested documentation from my organization? And I think one thing that's interesting is that the California Privacy Authority, the regulator in California, fined Sephora a couple years ago based on their privacy practices. I might include a link to the enforcement action against Sephora by the CPPA below, because I think it's interesting that even in 2025, this cookie and personal data documentation has still not been updated. All right, if you are looking for privacy counsel and you would like to work with me, take a look at the description below. I'd love to work with your organization to make sure that you're complying with the data protection laws, and I'll see you in another video.